November 8th, 1942. 12:01 in the morning, Richmond, California. Korvettenkapitan Werner Hartmann set down the intelligence briefing with undisguised skepticism. The veteran U-boat commander, fresh from a war patrol that had sent 4 Allied freighters to the bottom of the Atlantic, studied the report from German naval intelligence about American shipbuilding claims. The Americans were boasting they could build cargo ships in weeks rather than months. Hartmann shook his head. It took German yards 8 to 9 months to construct a single merchant vessel. The idea that Americans, with their soft assembly line workers and inexperienced labor force, could build ocean-going ships faster defied every principle of shipbuilding he understood. These are propaganda fantasies, he told his fellow officers at the Lorient submarine base. The Americans know nothing of shipbuilding. Let them make their automobiles. Ships require craftsmen, not factory workers. What Hartmann did not know, what no German naval officer could have imagined, was that at that precise moment in Richmond, California, a crew of welders, many of them housewives and teenagers who had never seen a shipyard 6 months earlier, were about to shatter every assumption the Kriegsmarine held about American industrial capability. Within 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, they would complete a 10,500-ton cargo ship. Within 18 months, American shipyards would be launching vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. The mathematics of the Atlantic War was about to be rewritten by factory workers who approached shipbuilding the way Henry Ford approached automobiles. The German confidence was not unreasonable. Traditional shipbuilding was a craft requiring years of apprenticeship. A skilled riveter needed months of training to join steel plates properly. Ship construction proceeded sequentially, from keel to deck, with each phase dependent on the completion of the previous one. German shipyards employed master craftsmen whose families had built vessels for generations. The idea that unskilled workers could construct seaworthy ships seemed absurd. The U-boat arm had dominated the early Atlantic War with devastating effectiveness. During the first happy time of 1940, German submarines sank hundreds of vessels with minimal losses. The second happy time, following America's entry into the war, proved even more destructive. U-boats operating off the American East Coast found targets illuminated by city lights, sailing without escorts, following predictable routes. Tankers burned off the Jersey shore while vacationers watched from the beach. German submarine commanders became celebrities. Otto Kretschmer, the top-scoring ace, sank 44 merchant ships totaling over 266,000 tons before his capture. The top 20 U-boat commanders accounted for over 3 million tons of Allied shipping. These were not lucky strikes but systematic destruction by skilled professionals who understood how to find and attack merchant convoys in the vast Atlantic. German intelligence had been tracking American shipbuilding efforts since 1940. Their assessments were consistently dismissive. A report from the Abwehr in December 1941 noted that American yards were producing ships at a rate of approximately 230 days per vessel. At this pace, the report concluded, U-boat operations will sink Allied shipping faster than it can be replaced. The Atlantic War will be won through simple mathematics. The mathematics seemed to favor Germany. In 1941 and 1942, German U-boats and surface raiders sank 2,963 Allied ships. American yards, still tooling up for war production, built only 863 replacement vessels during the same period. The gap appeared insurmountable. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of U-boat operations, calculated that sinking 700,000 gross, registered tons monthly would collapse British supply lines. His wolf packs were approaching that figure in early 1942. What German intelligence failed to grasp was that they were measuring American capability by European standards. Henry J. Kaiser had never built a ship before 1940. He had built the Hoover Dam, the Bonneville Dam, and the Grand Coulee Dam. He understood nothing about traditional shipbuilding and that ignorance would prove revolutionary. Kaiser approached the problem differently than any shipbuilder before him. Why, he asked his engineers, must ships be built from the keel up? Why cannot the sections be built simultaneously and then assembled? His associates visited Ford's assembly plant in Detroit and returned with radical ideas. If automobiles could be built from prefabricated components on a moving line, why not ships? The traditional shipbuilders laughed. Ships are not automobiles, they insisted. The stresses are different. The precision required is impossible with unskilled labor. Kaiser ignored them. He designed his Richmond shipyards around automotive principles, with prefabrication facilities feeding completed sections to assembly areas where massive cranes lifted them into position. The technical challenges were immense. A Liberty ship contained 250,000 individual parts weighing 14 million pounds. The hull stretched 441 feet long and 56 feet wide. 5 cargo holds could carry over 9,000 tons of supplies. The triple expansion steam engine, fed by 2 oil-fired boilers, produced 2,500 horsepower. Every component had to meet specifications that would allow the vessel to survive North Atlantic storms and enemy attack. German shipbuilders understood these requirements intimately. Their vessels were constructed by craftsmen who had spent years learning the precise techniques required for ocean-going ships. The stresses on a hull in heavy seas were enormous. A poorly welded seam could crack under wave action. An improperly installed bulkhead could collapse during a storm. A flawed engine mount could shake itself apart on a long voyage. Traditional shipbuilding addressed these challenges through generations of accumulated expertise. What Kaiser proposed seemed reckless to experienced shipbuilders on both sides of the Atlantic. He would take workers with no maritime experience and train them in weeks rather than years. He would replace the painstaking craft of riveting with welding techniques still considered experimental for ship construction. He would build vessels in sections across the country and somehow assemble them into seaworthy ships. Every assumption of traditional shipbuilding would be violated. The British, who had originated the basic Liberty ship design, watched American adaptation with skepticism. Their ocean-class vessels, the template for the American design, were built using modified traditional methods. They had provided the design because their own yards were fully committed to naval construction and could not produce merchant ships in sufficient quantity. They did not expect Americans to revolutionize the construction process itself. Admiral Emory S. Land, chairman of the U.S. Maritime Commission, understood that the Liberty program required scale never before attempted. He established 18 shipyards dedicated to Liberty construction, coordinating production across facilities from Maine to California. The standardization was absolute. Drawings and specifications were identical across all yards. A bulkhead section built at Bethlehem Fairfield in Baltimore would fit precisely with hull plates from Kaiser Richmond. This interchangeability enabled procurement from thousands of suppliers, each producing components that could be used at any yard. Kaiser's solution was standardization taken to extremes never before attempted in shipbuilding. Every Liberty ship would be identical. Parts manufactured in factories across the country would be completely interchangeable. A double-bottom section built in Ohio would fit perfectly with a deckhouse assembled in California. This approach allowed simultaneous production. While the keel was being laid, workers elsewhere were already constructing the bow section, the stern assembly, and the engine room components. The shift from riveting to welding proved equally revolutionary. Traditional riveting required highly skilled workers who had trained for years. Each Liberty ship would have needed millions of rivets, with teams of riveters working in sequence. Welding was faster and could be taught to novice workers in weeks rather than years. Women, who lacked the physical strength for riveting but possessed the steady hands and attention to detail welding required, proved exceptionally capable. The transformation of the American workforce was unprecedented. Before Pearl Harbor, shipyards employed almost exclusively white men with years of experience. Kaiser recruited anyone willing to work. By February 1943, women comprised nearly 14% of all production workers at the Richmond shipyards. They accounted for 41% of laborers, 37% of boilermakers, and nearly 20% of welders. African Americans, recruited from across the country, formed a significant portion of the workforce despite resistance from unions. Mary Carroll arrived at Kaiser's Portland shipyard in April 1942, one of the first women hired as a welder. Her 27-year-old son had been lost at Bataan. She had never held an industrial job. Within weeks, she was welding hull sections with 99% accuracy. Across Kaiser's 7 shipyards, thousands of similar stories unfolded as housewives, teachers, and secretaries transformed into skilled industrial workers. Kaiser provided services unheard of in American industry. His shipyards offered on-site childcare, allowing mothers to work full shifts while their children attended supervised programs. He established prepaid health care for workers and their families, the foundation of what would become Kaiser Permanente. Hot meals were available around the clock for workers on rotating shifts. These innovations were not charity. They were calculated to maximize productivity by removing obstacles that might keep workers from their jobs. The results appeared in September 1942. Kaiser's Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation completed the Joseph N. Teal in just 10 days from keel laying to launch. President Franklin Roosevelt secretly attended the christening. When reporters asked Kaiser if it could have been done faster, he replied that it could have been built in 8 days, but was delayed to accommodate the president's schedule. Roosevelt proposed a challenge: build a ship in half the time. Kaiser accepted. The target would be the Richmond shipyard No. 2, which was already averaging 50 days per vessel. The ship would be the 47th built at that yard, named after Arctic explorer Robert E. Peary. The preparation began weeks in advance. Workers prefabricated sections throughout the yard and pre-positioned them for rapid assembly. Welding teams were assigned specific stations and drilled on their sequences. Crane operators practiced lifting and placing the massive components. The entire yard was organized around a single purpose, proving that American industry could build ships at speeds that would break German calculations. At 12:01 on the morning of November 8, 1942, the keel plate was lowered into position. The clock started. What followed was industrial coordination at a scale never before achieved. 3 shifts of workers, totaling thousands of men and women, rotated through the yard without pause. Sections weighing hundreds of tons were lifted by cranes and positioned with precision measured in fractions of inches. Welders worked in teams, completing seams that would hold the vessel together against the forces of the Atlantic. The yard employed 17 banks of welding machines on each side of the hull, allowing simultaneous work along the entire length of the ship. Pre-assembly of the deck in 7 large sections rather than 23 smaller pieces accelerated construction dramatically. Deck houses arrived complete with bunks, ventilation fans, flooring, and even door hardware already installed. Workers had only to position these finished structures and weld them to the superstructure. Crane operators worked with choreographed precision. Each major section had been assigned a numbered position and a specific installation time. The sequence was planned to minimize crane movements and maximize the time workers could spend welding rather than waiting. When one section was positioned, the crane was already moving toward the next component staged in the prefabrication area. By the end of the first day, the double bottom was complete. Workers had welded the longitudinal girders and transverse frames that form the ship's structural foundation. The following morning, bulkheads were rising. By the third day, deck sections were being lowered into position. Deck houses, pre-assembled with bunks, fans, and flooring already installed, were lifted whole and welded to the superstructure. The pace was relentless but not reckless. Every weld was inspected. Every seam was tested. The ship had to be seaworthy, not merely complete. Kaiser understood that a vessel that broke apart in the Atlantic would destroy the very propaganda victory he sought. The workers took equal pride in quality. Many had sons, husbands, and brothers who would depend on ships like this one for survival. At 3:30 in the afternoon on November 12, 1942, the SS Robert E. Peary slid down the ways into San Francisco Bay. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes had elapsed since the keel was laid. 250,000 parts had been assembled into a functional cargo ship. The 14 million pounds of steel that had arrived as plates and shapes now floated as a vessel capable of crossing any ocean on Earth. 3 days later, the Peary was completed and handed over to the Maritime Commission, fully outfitted and ready for service. She would go on to make multiple Atlantic crossings, deliver troops and equipment to Omaha Beach on June 7, 1944, under constant enemy attack, and survive the war to be scrapped in 1963. The ship, built in 4 days, served for 21 years. If you are learning about these lesser-known American achievements for the first time, subscribing helps us uncover more stories that deserve to be told. The German response to reports of the Peary's construction was disbelief. Intelligence officers dismissed it as propaganda, a staged event that could not represent actual production capability. They were correct that the Peary was a publicity stunt, what Kaiser called an incentive ship. They were catastrophically wrong about what it represented. The Peary demonstrated the potential of American methods. Normal production at Kaiser's yards, without the extraordinary preparation and concentrated resources devoted to the record attempt, was already achieving what German planners considered impossible. By 1943, Kaiser shipyards were completing Liberty ships in an average of 42 days. At the start of the program in 1941, the same ships had required 355 days and 1.4 million man-hours. By 1943, the figure had dropped to under 500,000 man-hours. The numbers told an inescapable story of American dominance. In 1943 alone, American shipyards completed 1,896 Liberty ships, more than one every 5 hours around the clock. 3 Liberty ships were being launched every single day across the 18 yards producing them. The production rate exceeded not only German expectations, but German comprehension. Each Liberty ship that slid down the ways represented devastating cargo capacity for the Allied war effort. A single vessel could carry 2,840 jeeps. If those jeeps were loaded on a train, it would stretch 2 1/3 miles. The same ship could transport 440 light tanks or 260 medium tanks. A Liberty loaded with ammunition could deliver 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition or 41 million rounds of 50 caliber. One ship, one voyage, could supply an entire division for weeks of combat. The cost was equally remarkable. Each Liberty ship was built for approximately $1.8 million, with costs ranging from $1.5 to $2.1 million, depending on the yard. At this price, the Maritime Commission calculated that a Liberty had to complete only half its maiden voyage to be considered economically successful. One trip across the Atlantic and the ship had paid for itself. Everything after was profit against the investment. German U-boat commanders began noticing the change in late 1942. Major Johannes Steinhoff, commanding Fighter Group 77 over the Mediterranean, observed that American pilots were no longer amateurs. More disturbing, he noted, there are more of them every day. The same observation applied to the merchant ships his naval colleagues were hunting. Wolf packs would sink dozens of vessels, only to find the convoys growing larger on subsequent patrols. The mathematics Dönitz had relied upon was collapsing. His U-boats needed to sink 700,000 tons monthly to strangle Britain. They achieved this figure only once in November 1942. After that, the curves diverged sharply. American shipyards, led by Kaiser's facilities, were producing tonnage faster than the entire U-boat fleet could destroy it. By September 1942, the inflection point had passed. In that month, American yards delivered 713,000 tons of new shipping, while U-boats sank 500,000 tons. The gap would only widen. In December 1943, total Allied shipping losses since the start of the war were finally replaced by new construction. American industry had not merely stopped the bleeding, it had overwhelmed the wound with production. While American workers produced ships by the thousand, German industry retreated into fantasy. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, proposed dispersing submarine production into underground facilities using slave labor. The Mittelwerk complex employed 60,000 prisoners in horrific conditions, with 20,000 dying during construction. These facilities produced more defects than vessels. Sabotage was endemic. Transportation between dispersed sites caused constant delays. The entire Mittelwerk complex produced fewer submarines monthly than a single Kaiser shipyard produced cargo ships. The disparity in industrial philosophy was absolute. American yards benefited from workers who wanted to build ships. They arrived voluntarily, attracted by good wages, and motivated by genuine patriotism. Their sons and husbands were sailing on the vessels they constructed. Quality was a personal concern because personal stakes were involved. When a welder completed a seam, she knew that seam might be all that stood between a crew and the Atlantic. German submarine production relied increasingly on forced labor as the war continued. Concentration camp prisoners, worked to exhaustion, and fed starvation rations had every reason to ensure their work failed. Sabotage was difficult to detect and impossible to prevent entirely. Submarines assembled from components built by enemies of the Reich sailed with defects that only revealed themselves in combat. Engines failed at critical moments, periscopes fogged, hull welds cracked under depth charge attack. The products of slave labor proved inferior to the products of free workers. The contrast extended beyond production numbers to production philosophy. American workers arrived trained, housed, fed, and motivated by wages that represented genuine prosperity. They were building ships that would carry their own husbands and sons to victory. German slave laborers, starving and brutalized, had every reason to sabotage the products of their forced work. American quality improved throughout the war as workers gained experience. German quality collapsed as skilled workers died on the Eastern Front and were replaced by prisoners who had nothing to lose. The Battle of the Atlantic reached its turning point in May 1943. That month, 41 U-boats were destroyed, more than in the first 3 years of the war. Combined, the losses were catastrophic and unsustainable. Convoy SC-130 saw at least 3 U-boats destroyed without losing a single merchant ship. Convoy ONS-5, attacked by 30 U-boats, lost 13 merchant ships but destroyed 6 submarines and forced Dönitz to call off the attack. The human cost for Germany was staggering. 648 U-boats were lost during the war, 429 of them with no survivors. Of these, 215 were lost on their first patrol before inexperienced crews could learn the skills needed for survival. Around 30,000 of the 40,000 men who served in U-boats perished. The submarines that German planners believed would strangle Britain became steel coffins for an entire generation of young men. What German commanders could not accept was that the balance had shifted permanently. They tried adapting tactics. Some U-boats were converted to flak boats with enhanced anti-aircraft armament, attempting to fight off the patrol aircraft that were finding them with increasing frequency. In May alone, 5 U-boats were sunk, and 7 more forced to abort after aerial attacks. The aircraft were everywhere because American factories were producing them in quantities that Germany could not match. Dönitz continued sending submarines to sea even after withdrawing from the North Atlantic, hoping to tie down Allied resources and relieve pressure on other German forces. The strategy produced only more dead submariners. By war's end, a U-boat was being sunk for every merchant ship it torpedoed. The exchange rate made continued operations strategically pointless, yet the submarines kept sailing until Germany's final collapse. The production disparity extended across every category of naval construction. While Kaiser's yards launched 3 Liberty ships daily, American facilities were simultaneously producing escort carriers, destroyer escorts, submarines, landing ships, and patrol craft. The Casablanca-class escort carriers, built by Kaiser using Liberty ship production techniques, entered service at a rate of 1 per week. These small carriers provided air cover for convoys, closing the mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats had previously hunted with impunity. The Liberty Ship program generated innovations that spread throughout American industry. Statistical quality control, developed to ensure weld integrity across thousands of joints, became a standard manufacturing practice. The modular construction techniques pioneered at Richmond influenced everything from aircraft production to post-war housing. Workers who learned precision manufacturing in the shipyards carried those skills into the peacetime economy. Kaiser himself became a symbol of American industrial capability. His face appeared on magazine covers. Newsreels featured his shipyards as evidence of democratic production power. When reporters asked how American yards could build ships so much faster than German facilities, Kaiser's answer was simple. We build them the way we build everything else in America. We break down the job, train people to do their piece perfectly, and then assemble the results. Traditional shipbuilders build ships. We manufacture them. On May 24, 1943, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz made the agonizing decision to withdraw his U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy lanes. In his memoirs, he wrote with painful clarity, "Wolf pack operations against convoys in the North Atlantic were no longer possible. I withdrew the boats from the North Atlantic on May 24th. We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The reason for this defeat was not primarily tactical. It was not improved Allied detection equipment, though that contributed. It was not better trained escort crews, though they played a role. The fundamental cause was arithmetic. American shipyards were producing many more ships than U-boats could sink. German shipyards were producing fewer submarines than Allied forces were destroying. The exchange rate had become impossible. Dönitz's aim in the tonnage war had been to sink Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. As losses fell and production rose, particularly in the United States, this became mathematically impossible. By the end of the war, German U-boats had sunk 6,000 ships, totaling 21 million gross registered tons. Allied shipyards, predominantly American, had built over 38 million tons of new shipping. The U-boat campaign had destroyed half of what America alone produced, while losing 720 submarines and 30,000 crewmen. The production victory extended far beyond the Atlantic. Liberty ships served in every theater. They carried troops and supplies to North Africa for Operation Torch. They delivered equipment for the invasion of Sicily and Italy. They transported the vast logistical requirements of the Pacific Island hopping campaign. On D-Day, Liberty ships formed the backbone of the supply fleet that sustained the Normandy beachhead. The statistics of Liberty ship operations defy easy comprehension. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards completed 2,711 Liberty ships. Kaiser's 7 yards produced 1,490 vessels, 27% of all maritime commission construction. These ships collectively carried 2/3 of all cargo leaving the United States during the war. 200 were lost to enemy action, yet the fleet continued growing faster than losses could accumulate. The transformation in construction time illustrated American industrial learning at its most impressive. The first Liberty, Patrick Henry, took 244 days. By mid-1943, median production time had dropped to 39 days. Oregon shipbuilding maintained a pace of 17 days per ship during peak production. The record achievement with Yazzie, Robert E. Peary, while exceptional, pointed toward what systematic improvement could accomplish. Labor productivity rose at an average annual rate of 40% throughout the program. Workers who had never seen a shipyard in 1941 became skilled craftsmen by 1943. The techniques they developed, statistical quality control, modular prefabrication, and integrated production flow, became standard industrial practice worldwide. The Japanese and South Korean shipbuilding industries that would dominate global markets in later decades built their methods on foundations laid at Richmond and Portland. German officers captured late in the war were confronted with production statistics they could not believe. Major George Brooking of the 365th Fighter Group recounted an exchange at Airfield Y-34 in Metz after Operation Bodenplatte. German fighters had destroyed 22 Thunderbolts on the ground during their January 1st, 1945 attack. A captured German pilot pointed at the burning aircraft and taunted, "What do you think of that?" Brooking pointed to the flight line where ground crews were already pushing damaged aircraft aside and preparing for replacements. "By tomorrow, we will have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" Within 48 hours, factory-fresh aircraft filled the flight line. The same industrial capacity that produced Liberty ships was producing aircraft, tanks, trucks, and every other implement of war in quantities Germany could never match. Admiral Dönitz, interrogated after Germany's surrender, struggled to articulate the scale of American production. "I knew American industrial potential was great," he told his captors, "but the execution exceeded my worst fears. Their shipyards produced more vessels than our entire submarine fleet could hope to sink. The mathematics became impossible from the moment they achieved full production. The workers who achieved this transformation were not professional shipbuilders. They were former waitresses like Eastine Cowner, who worked as a scaler on the SS George Washington Carver. They were grieving mothers like Mary Carroll, whose first shift at the yard came weeks after learning her son was missing in action. They were teenagers who left high school to contribute to the war effort and retirees who came out of retirement to do the same. The workforce transformation itself became a subject of German intelligence reports. Luftwaffe analysts initially dismissed photographs of women welding ship hulls as propaganda. When the evidence became undeniable, they interpreted it as desperation, proof that America was scraping the bottom of its labor pool. A captured Luftwaffe intelligence report predicted that quality would collapse as inexperienced workers replaced skilled craftsmen. The opposite occurred. Defect rates at Kaiser yards dropped from 3.2% to 0.3%. As women inspectors brought unprecedented attention to detail, German prisoners of war who worked near American ports during the last months of the war witnessed the production firsthand. Many could not believe what they saw. Ships materialized faster than seemed physically possible. Convoys departed with regularity that suggested infinite supply. One captured U-boat officer, brought to Norfolk after his submarine was destroyed, watched Liberty ships loading in the harbor. He later told interrogators that seeing those ships broke his spirit more than losing his command. "We had been told American production was propaganda. The ships in that harbor told us we had lost the war years ago and simply had not known it." Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, provided extensive testimony at Nuremberg about the impact of American production. He stated unequivocally that American attacks, following a definite system of assault on industrial targets, caused the breakdown of German armaments. But bombing was only part of the story. The sheer volume of American production meant that even if German factories had been untouched, they could never have matched Allied output. "We were fighting an industrial war with artisan methods," Speer admitted. The Americans had invented industrial warfare itself. Naval historian Stephen Roskill, writing in the years after the war, placed the Battle of the Atlantic among the most decisive naval engagements in history. Because convoy battles are marked only by latitude and longitude and have no names that ring in memory like Matapan or Midway, the victory of May 1943 is scarcely remembered. Yet it was, in its own way, as decisive as the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940. The Liberty ships that made that victory possible remain equally obscure, their contribution buried in statistics rather than celebrated in stories. Today, only two operational Liberty ships survive, the SS John W. Brown in Baltimore and the SS Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco. Both serve as floating museums, maintained by volunteers who remember what these ungainly vessels meant to the war effort. The O'Brien returned to Normandy for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, steaming across the same waters she had crossed half a century earlier. Her presence was a reminder that the Allied victory depended on tens of thousands of crossings by ships just like her, built by workers whose names were never recorded but whose contribution was decisive. By war's end, 1.5 million Americans had worked in Liberty ship construction. Women, who comprised less than 1% of shipyard workers in 1941, represented 30% of the workforce by 1942's end. African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans all contributed despite discrimination and segregation that limited their opportunities. The democratic mobilization of American industrial capacity achieved what totalitarian command could not. Werner Hartmann, the U-boat commander who had dismissed American shipbuilding capability in November 1942, did not survive to see the full extent of his miscalculation. His submarine was lost with all hands in May 1943 during Black May, the month that broke the U-boat arm. But his dismissal echoed through the entire German naval establishment, a catastrophic underestimation that cost Germany the Atlantic War. November 8, 1942, 12:01 in the morning, Richmond, California. German naval intelligence had calculated that American shipyards required 8 to 9 months to build a merchant vessel. Within 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, Kaiser's workers proved them wrong by a factor of 60. The laughter at Lorient submarine base died with the U-boats. The mathematics of production had defeated the tactics of undersea warfare. By May 1945, there were no German submarines left to challenge American shipping. The wolf packs that had terrorized the Atlantic in 1942 had been hunted to extinction. 30,000 German submariners lay dead at the bottom of the ocean. The cargo ships they had dismissed as impossible to build in weeks were still crossing every ocean on Earth, carrying the supplies that would occupy Germany and rebuild Europe. Henry Kaiser never received a military rank. His workers never wore uniforms. But they had won one of the most decisive victories of the Second World War. The housewives and teenagers of Richmond, California, had outproduced the master craftsmen of German shipyards. They had proven that American industrial democracy could overwhelm German military efficiency. They had built the ships that sank the U-boat campaign. Dönitz had been right about one thing. The Battle of the Atlantic would be decided by mathematics. He simply calculated with the wrong numbers. Germany could produce dozens of submarines monthly. America could produce dozens of Liberty ships daily. The equation was never close. American production did not merely defeat German U-boats. It buried them under an avalanche of steel and welding wire that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The SS Robert E. Peary, built in 4 days by workers who had never seen a shipyard 6 months earlier, outlasted the entire U-boat fleet. She carried troops to Normandy, while the submarines that were supposed to stop her rusted on the ocean floor. Her very existence was an answer to German contempt, proof that free workers building for victory could outproduce slave laborers building under compulsion. The Liberty ship miracle was not about one remarkable vessel. It was about 2,711 of them built by Americans who transformed industrial capability into the most decisive weapon of the war. The engineers who designed Liberty ship assembly lines would later design the Saturn V rocket. The women who welded Liberty ship hulls raised children who walked on the moon. The production techniques developed at Richmond and Portland became the foundation of American industrial dominance that lasted for generations. The Liberty ship program did not merely win a war, it launched the American century. At the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park, located on the site of the former Kaiser Richmond shipyards, visitors can still see the facilities where this transformation occurred. The workers are gone, the cranes have been dismantled, but the achievement remains. Free citizens, working together toward a common purpose, built more ships faster than anyone believed possible. They proved that democracy could out-manufacture dictatorship, that voluntary cooperation could exceed forced obedience, and that American workers, given the tools and the opportunity, could accomplish the impossible. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz was right about the mathematics of the Atlantic War. He simply had the wrong numbers. German submarines could sink hundreds of thousands of tons monthly at the peak of their effectiveness. American shipyards could replace millions of tons annually without breaking stride. The calculation was never close. It was industrial annihilation disguised as naval warfare, and the outcome was determined the moment Henry Kaiser proved that ships could be built like automobiles by workers who had never built anything larger than a garden shed. The German officers who laughed at American shipbuilding capability in November 1942 were not fools. They were professionals, applying reasonable assumptions to an unreasonable situation. What they could not imagine was that the rules themselves would change, that Americans would reinvent shipbuilding rather than master it, and that housewives and teenagers would outproduce the master craftsmen of Europe. Their laughter died with the U-boats. The Liberty ships kept sailing,